Hello, everybody. Welcome back. To those of you who were in the last one, this is ATSB Phase 2, coming back from a few weeks ago. I would like to just do a quick reminder before I introduce our panelists that we do have the virtual dashboard, which will host our exhibitor rooms as well as our matchmaking rooms. So I'm going to be posting a link here. So after the seminar, I highly encourage everybody to pop in there. There is a matchmaking function in there as well, serving as the show floor where you can network with other attendees, ask questions to show staff, and our speakers will be popping in and out of there as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists for this session. The title is The Impact and Insights of Trade. I'd like to invite back to the virtual stage Julia K. Hughes, President of the United States Fashion Industry Association, and Dr. Sheng Liu, Associate Professor from the Department of Fashion and Apparel Studies from the University of Delaware. Sheng is going to be joining us today via the telephone. Julia, whenever you are ready, you can go ahead and share. There you are. Hello there.
Hi.
Welcome, welcome. So I will go ahead and give you the floor now. I'd like to remind everybody really quick that we do have a chat and Q&A function here on the Zoom platform. Please post your questions there. And to everybody watching on Facebook Live, please post your questions there and they will be relayed to me. We will address those at the end during the Q&A segment. So Julia, the virtual stage is yours.
We're going to talk today about some of the impacts and insights of trade. Sheng is going to talk about the trade data, and I'm going to talk a bit about the politics here. So how about next slide? For those of you who haven't heard me speak before and don't know very much about the US Fashion Industry Association, our tagline is fashion made possible by global trade. And I think that tells you a lot about our perspective and our support for more trade and the importance of how we all work together around the world. So next slide. What we do at USFIA is we focus on 3 areas: communication to our members, education, where we do a lot of webinars and participate in great events like this one, and of course, advocacy. So what the industry needs, what is it that we can share with the administration? Next slide. So what are the trends and challenges for 2021? And when you hear Sheng's presentation, he's going to talk a lot about the impact of COVID-19, building new sourcing strategies. And then I'm going to focus a little bit more on the trade wars and as we are moving toward a new trade policy. Next slide. So, just the bottom line, COVID-19 affects everything today. Whenever I'm talking to brands and retailers, obviously the outlook, the current critical situation here in the US, particularly with the outbreak of COVID, is really coloring everyone's minds as we're going forward. Next slide. But things are getting better when we look at retail sales. And I just wanted to kind of quickly put in this slide, and you'll all have access to the presentation later. If we look at retail sales in September, what was up the highest was clothing and accessory stores. And I think that reflects the fact that, we're bouncing back. Consumers are ready to purchase more. We're looking forward to holidays. So things are improving from where we were just a few months ago. Next slide. Just a reminder of what a mall looks like for those of you who haven't been. Let's go to the next slide. So I have 2 slides on holiday outlook. Next slide. And we shared a presentation from USFIA's partner, PwC, on their holiday outlook. And I thought it was so relevant for the discussion today of, more than half of consumers said that they will spend the same or more this holiday season. Even though a little bit more than half said they're confronting, difficulties and concerns with their income levels due to the pandemic, from reduced income, reduced employment hours, furloughs, redundancies. We all know what's going on in the industry. Next slide. And then online shopping is the clear winner. Is that retail sales are up. Obviously, online is going to be surging as it has been over past years, but even more in 2020. Next slide. So I'd like to say a few words from our benchmarking study. Let's go to the next slide. And Sheng's going to talk a lot more about the outcome, but I want to just share the bad news, good news. The bad news: less optimism about the next 5 years. And what we heard from respondents is that looking 5 years ahead, we had the lowest level of optimistic or somewhat optimistic than we've had in the history of the benchmarking study. However, it still was 57.9% were optimistic and somewhat optimistic, which I would argue is not as bad news as you might have thought. And the next slide for what is the really good news is that companies are planning to hire more people, that even in the depth of the pandemic, the job market is still promising, and particularly for folks looking for jobs in sustainability and compliance related areas, supply chain specialists, sourcing scientists, and especially data scientists. There definitely are more jobs out there, and I think that's really good news. Next slide. So let's talk about the election, because that really is the top of mind these days. Next slide. So I guess we have to call this election month, and hopefully it's only election month. So we know the outcome of the election, but we still are having legal disputes, recounts. So election time is not quite over yet, but we can anticipate, not quite yet. We can anticipate that we're going to have a Biden administration. And so what are kind of the key takeaways of Trump trade policy versus Biden trade policy? And I think we want to look at, if we think about how do we summarize Trump trade policy? Unpredictable, unilateral action. 4 years ago when we were doing webinars about what to expect from a Trump administration, trade lawyers were talking about more use of unilateral measures like 301s and the 232 cases, but no one really thought they were going to happen. That's not the universe we're in today. We're also seeing more policy announcements in the Trump administration. It's on Twitter, and definitely a more divisive mood. Biden trade policy, what do we expect? And it's not going to be the same thing as Obama trade policy, but we still can look at what do we know already? Biden is looking for more global alliances, so less unilateral action, more following the process. Pretty much if you look at who's engaged in the transition so far, we're more likely to have interagency collaboration, and we're going to have Federal Register notices before it's announced on Twitter. So I definitely think we're going to see differences there. Less social media in general for policy decisions, and definitely, of course, the call for unity. So next slide. I'm stealing this slide from our Washington Counsel, David Spooner, to kind of share with you what was really interesting in some of the exit polling after November 3rd, and what groups have shifted to be more Republican, and what groups have shifted to be more Democrat. And we're kind of seeing, we're moving more toward the center, you might argue, from folks on different ends of the spectrum. But if we look at white non-college men and women, they've shifted to a bit more Democratic. But if we're looking at, Hispanic and Black voters, they have shifted to more Republican. So real diversity here, and no clear one single thing that we learned from the election. Next slide. The last thing I want to say about exit polling, because I just thought this was so fascinating, and depending on what news you watch depends on how you perceive COVID-19. And so if COVID is the big issue for all of us, if your news only came from Fox News, 90% of the people thought the US has controlled the outbreak as much as we could. Conversely, for folks who only watch MSNBC, CNN, or NPR, 97% say the US has not controlled the outbreak as much as it could. And I think that highlights for me, I think, what we're seeing when we're looking at the division and totally different perspectives in the country. Next slide. Okay, so if we look at the impact of the election, obviously, whatever we're doing on trade policy, China remains the main target. And I think the big question we have to have during the next 60 days until we have a new president, will there be new tariffs and sanctions during this time period? I think we have to be concerned that the Trump administration is going to take more actions. What they might be, we don't know yet, but we know that it's under consideration before they walk out the door. And also, we can't just think only about China as a target, but the European Union and Vietnam are also trade targets. Next slide. So a few slides here, just kind of looking at the China issues. And another slide for those of you who were at USFIA's conference next week, you'll know that I cribbed this one from David Spooner also because of the great backpack picture. Before the end of the year, though, the administration has a decision to make. Are they going to extend the exclusions to the Section 301 tariffs that are currently in place on China? There are some products, not as many as we might have liked, but some products that are excluded from the 301 tariffs because of the lack of availability elsewhere in the world. But those exclusions expire December 31st. Will the administration renew them? Will they not renew them? I'd say that's one of the biggest questions that we have to answer and are really concerned about right now. Next slide. And what happens in product exclusions really has obviously something to do with, our relationship with China. I mean, it's not as strong as it was 4 years ago. There are a lot of reasons why. There are concerns about the Uyghurs, and I have another slide about that as well. We have concerns about Hong Kong and the Chinese intervention into Hong Kong and Hong Kong elections. We have withhold release orders that are in place from customs. And we have later this month a prohibition on doing business with XPCC and its subsidiaries, which is a major concern for anyone who is sourcing from China. Next slide. Earlier this year, and unusually, 4 departments, State, Treasury, Commerce, and the Department of Homeland Security issued a joint supply chain business advisory on doing business in China because of the supply chain exposure to forced labor in Xinjiang. What was surprising about this was the fact that the 4 agencies worked together on it. Not surprising to folks in the fashion industry was that you need to know what's happening in your supply chain and be aware of the concern on forced labor, which I think everybody in the fashion industry was already doing. Next slide. We also have legislation in Congress, and this is just one of the pieces of legislation which passed the House on Forced Labor Prevention Act, which once again, while we're in this time period between the Trump administration and a Biden administration, we still have Congress is back in session this month, that we have the potential for additional action against China. And questions about what would a President Trump do if this legislation reaches his desk. Next slide. But, while China is top of mind, and China has certainly been the defining global relationship for the Trump administration, we go back to this kind of surprising statement from President Trump criticizing Vietnam. And that really leads us to, so what action has the administration taken? As most of you know, we have pending an investigation for a 301 case against Vietnam. Next slide. The case against Vietnam is based on currency manipulation, as well as allegations of use of illegal timber. Obviously, I would say the announcement of the initiation of this investigation sent shivers down the spine of most of the companies in the fashion industry. And when you see Sheng's presentation and the data, because so many companies migrated to Vietnam, Indeed, almost every company in our benchmarking survey and every company that I talk with is sourcing some product in Vietnam these days. So not only is there the concern about the 301 case with a precedent to use tariffs and quotas against currency manipulation, but also really challenging what has been the destination for those companies who shifted production from China. I also want to say it also kind of highlights, I think, some of the divisiveness of this moment in politics, because while we look at the public comments that were filed last week on this 301 case, and we saw brands, retailers, certainly organizations like USFIA and other trade associations file comments against the 301 on Vietnam. We saw the US domestic textile industry file comments supporting this 301, and indeed in their comments saying that if the 301 goes forward, they want there to be penalty tariffs on textile and apparel products imported from Vietnam. And I think that kind of reflects a lot of the division, since normally you would not necessarily go public to say we want to take action against our customers, but that's kind of where we are today, even in trade policy. Next slide. Just briefly also, I mean, there's also potential retaliation, and we'll see if the Trump administration decides to go forward with that against digital services taxes. This started with France, but the US is also considering taking action against other countries until there is some kind of international standard. There's the perception, the view that digital services taxes are mainly going to harm American companies overseas. So we do have some concerns about this moving forward as well, and that would be a big hit on Europe. Next slide. So my summary, obviously, so tariffs and the trade war are not over immediately. Last week at USFIA's conference, we did a poll question where we asked the audience, what did they think about China? Were we going to see the outcome of the US-China trade war now that the election was over? And it was really interesting. Only 6% of the respondents said that they thought that the Biden administration would end the trade war with China. Only 6%. And evenly split, 47% said they thought the tariffs and the trade war would remain for the foreseeable future, which is kind of a scary prospect. And another 47% said they thought pressure on China would continue, but that the tariffs would be eliminated, which I think is probably the more likely outcome. Next slide. So, I mean, just to say a word about, so what has Joe Biden really said about trade? In July, the Biden campaign released a plan to rebuild America's supply chains with a lot of focus on high tech. While campaigning in Michigan, Biden talked about a 10% tariff on goods that had been made in the US and then were moved offshore. So I think that definitely shows you kind of some of the thinking from the Biden team. Next slide. It also, some specific proposals on how to promote domestic production, made in America tax credits, some tax penalties and elimination of deductions for jobs moved overseas. And then today also, kind of confirmation of using the Defense Production Authorization Act to manufacture PPE here in the US. And that's likely to be something that the Biden administration does on day one. Next slide, please. So last few slides for me, just to say, so what else is there on trade policy? What do we need to think about? And where might we see action by a Trump administration, and that we're pressing the Biden administration? So first is GSP. GSP expires at the end of this year. Last time it expired, we had several months before it was renewed. And so that's a problem for companies. And we do have more, even though GSP is not allowed for most apparel products, we do have travel goods and other textile products that are eligible. Next slide. Miscellaneous of tariff bill. Also, this is something else that expires at the end of this year. And not to get into the weeds about it, so it allows suspension or reductions in duties for products that are not made in the US. The ITC had sent its recommendations to Congress for an MTB, but we don't, and I'm not sure that the Trump administration has been too supportive of this concept, so we may not see this renewed this year. And then next slide, last thing to mention, Trade Promotion Authority. This expires in July of next year. And whether it was a Trump administration or a Biden administration, we're going to need to look to the Congress to see, are they going to give the authority to negotiate more trade agreements? We currently are in the middle of negotiating with the United Kingdom and with Kenya. There are lots of folks who think that the administration and a Biden administration may think about rejoining what has become of the TPP, although I'm skeptical that that's something that happens on early days. But definitely we have more on the agenda, and it's going to be a pretty hectic next couple of weeks and into next year. And next slide. Hope to see you all in person soon. Thanks for the chance to join you. And I know we're going to turn it over to Sheng now to see the data, and then look forward to your questions. Thanks so much.
Can you guys see my screen and hear me? Perfect. All right, thank you so much for inviting me to speak at the virtual 2020 Apparel Textile Sourcing event. And I'm very honored, and also I'm really excited to work with Julie on this project. Actually my presentation will echo many points, great points mentioned by Julie's presentation. So as an economist, I would try to kind of do two things. One is relatively easy. As economists, we're very good at explaining what has happened. But the second task is relatively challenging. That is to forecast what might happen next year. There's a saying, if you ask a question to 5 economists, and they will give you 10 different kind of numbers. But I will do my best. But also, the outcome, my comments are for your reference only. So, this year, 2020, actually, there are 2 really big events that are affecting the patterns of U.S. apparel imports and sourcing, that is COVID-19 and the trade war. So just thinking about how these 2 big events are affecting the patterns of trade. So here, I just compared how like the growth rate of the U.S. apparel imports from during the financial crisis and so far this year. And definitely, based on the numbers, you can see the impact of COVID-19 has been much worse. Okay. That being said, I think there are a few trends we probably can pay attention to. The first, actually, and also mentioned by Julia's presentation, that is, if you look at the census data, the good thing is U.S. consumers start to, U.S. consumers start to expand once again. So you can see, since May 2020, kind of the U.S. apparel consumption experienced a V-shaped recovery. V-shaped recovery. There are a lot of reasons why this is happening, like holiday season. I think this is a great factor, but no matter how, this is a very encouraging sign, okay? And because if you look at the data, 98% of apparel consumed in the US market actually relying on imports. So this is why the patterns of trade really echo the patterns of consumption. So this is the value of US apparel imports so far this year. The latest data up to September, you can see also is experienced a V-shaped recovery, Okay, and I think this trend likely may continue at least for 1 to 2 months. Why? Because once again, November and December, they're traditional holiday seasons. So surely, there has been some concern about the second or third wave of COVID-19. But the positive side is just thinking about what's happening since May. Actually, the COVID cases has never been really dropping, right? It is always kind of building and increasing. But as long as consumers are spending, well, I think the trade number actually will kind of continue to go up. And also, I just just compare the recovery process of U.S. apparel imports during a financial crisis and also so far this year. And also very interesting, we started from a much lower kind of level this year because COVID-19 really results in a much more significant drop of U.S. apparel imports. But at the same time, you can see the recovery process so far has been more robust than the financial crisis. And this is once again just for your reference. So based on my economic model, so I use some forecasting technique, and if we can keep the same momentum, keep the momentum regardless. Yes, regardless of the impact of the second or third wave of COVID, maybe as early as next February, we could see a positive growth of U.S. apparel imports. But once again, there are a lot of uncertainties out there. So maybe I'm wrong, but hopefully we can keep the momentum for recovery. Okay, so this is the overall trend. Second, I think this is also something of great interest to the audience. From where U.S. fashion brands and retailers are sourcing their apparel. In the news, somehow I have to say, in the news, we hear a lot of story about order cancellation. So, factories in many Asian countries, in particular, like Bangladesh, like Sri Lanka, Cambodia, they're suffering great loss. That's true. However, at the same time, if you look at, who gets the pie, I'm not saying the cake itself is getting bigger. It's truly, because of COVID, the cake is getting smaller. But if you're looking at who is getting more share of that cake, well, I think it's Asian countries. It's ASEAN members, definitely include Vietnam, but also Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, you name it. Their market share actually has been rising so far this year. And personally, I think we definitely should not only just look at sourcing from an individual Asian country. So when we're talking about Asia, as a sourcing base, we should look at the region, not just look at each individual country. Why is that? Because the product sourced from Asia actually is made in the region. Okay, it's made in the region. For example, this Levi jeans made in Cambodia, according to the label, but actually we should remember this product itself travel across multiple Asian countries. Okay, The same with Vietnam. We always say Vietnam is a rising star for apparel sourcing, but don't forget the majority of fabrics needed by Vietnam still relying on imports. And from where they got their fabrics, mostly from Asian countries like China, China. So when we're talking about the supply chain in Asia, I think there are two very important features we should keep in mind. The first is, I think it's a very complete one. How to understand that? If we break down the production process of the supply chain from very capital intensive, like making textile machinery, to very labor intensive process like cut and sew. Always you can find some Asian countries very good at doing this process. Okay, so always, because Asian countries, they're at different economic advancement levels. So always you can find some Asian countries very good at doing some process here. So the supply chain is very complete. But even more amazing, I think this is something we definitely should keep in mind. The supply chain in Asia is a dynamic one. How to understand that? Just look at history. Go back to 1950. Well, at that time, China was not the largest apparel manufacturer and exporter. It's Japanese companies that make most of the apparel. And then, 10 years later, once the Japanese economy becomes more sophisticated, Japanese companies start to move on to make textiles. But does it mean that apparel manufacturing left Asia? No. Okay, actually, four tigers like Hong Kong, Taiwan, they start to engage in making garment when the Japanese companies start to make textiles. And a few years later, okay, even the Ford Tiger started to make textiles, okay, and Japanese companies start to make even more capital intensive fibers, and garment manufacturing moved to China, and on and on. And right now, I think it's very, I think this is a phenomenon we all know. Even China start to make more textile products. Okay, Ford Tiger start to make fibers, and apparel manufacturing move on to countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Vietnam. But no matter how you can see from the whole process, what specific product each Asian country make actually will keep changing, okay, in accordance with the sophistication with of their national economy. But at the same time, you can see apparel manufacturing or the supply chain never left Asia. The supply chain never left Asia. So this is why there's a very very interesting and important phenomenon. I encourage you to think about some big events that are affecting textile and apparel trade from 2008 to 2019. Think about it. In my mind, I have a very long list, really. The financial crisis, wage level increase, trade war, exchange rate, to various trade agreements. However, if you look at this graph, if you look at the market share of Asian countries, not only just on the world stage, but also in the US market, in the EU market, in an Asian market, I mean, as if nothing happened. So stable, right? So stable. Why is that? Once again, I think this is exactly explained, what I mentioned in the previous slides. Okay, apparel manufacturing, the supply chain actually never left Asia, even though at the country level. At the country level, there are some changes. China started to make less apparel, and the less economic advanced economies in Asia, Bangladesh, Cambodia, you name it, they start to gain more market share. But no matter how, Asia as a whole, I think will continue. Even we have COVID-19 or even more trade war, but I think as a whole, Asian countries will remain the dominant sourcing base for US fashion brands and retailers. Okay. Next, China. I think China actually is kind of becoming more mysterious these days. Or, putting this way, there are a lot of different ideas about China's future as an apparel sourcing base. Well, on the one hand, there are a lot of discussion, well, let's remove sourcing from China to nearby countries, but also, especially recently, there has been some news reports saying, okay, sourcing orders are given back to China. So what's actually happening? Personally, I have two comments. One is, China is still relevant. Really, China is still relevant as an essential apparel sourcing base. Just look at the data, okay? By September 2020, still more than 40% of US apparel imports measured in quantity, and nearly 30% of US apparel imports measured by value came from China. Okay, if you no longer source from China, where else you can go? Really, the size itself is one very unique competitiveness of China as a sourcing base. So I think this is something we need to keep in mind. Second, here I look at some data that shows the variety of products, okay, US fashion brands and retailers can source from each country. So in terms of the variety, like the number of SKU available, okay, in the market, China far exceeds its competitors in Asia. So in putting this way, okay, you can really place orders, any products in any quantity from China, but you cannot do that, if you want to, just move the sourcing order from China to its competitor in China. So I think these two advantages really make US fashion brands and retailers very hesitant to totally give up sourcing from China. That being said, my second point is, still I think the overall trend, if you look at the long-term trend, still I think US companies want to reduce their exposure to China. They want to reduce their exposure to China. Don't be scared by these numbers. As an economist, I want to calculate some ratios, some indicators. I can just put it this way. Whenever I include China in the analysis, the results will tell me US companies are diversifying their sourcing base. And on the contrary, whenever I exclude China from the analysis, if I just look at China's competitor, like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, and the results will tell me US companies are concentrating their sourcing from these sourcing base. So once again, sourcing orders are moving away, gradually moving away from China to its competitor in Asia. So this trend, I don't think will change in the long term. And this is also, let's take a quick look at the results from the 2020 US fashion industry benchmarking study, which I had a great pleasure working with Julie for 6 years in the past 6 years. So really amazing. We talked to some of the largest US fashion brands and retailers to seek their inputs and their views on the industry outlook and their sourcing strategies. So this is how they look at sourcing from China in the next 2 years. Still over 70% of the surveyed companies say they will somewhat continue to reduce their China exposure. But once again, it is somewhat decreased. It's not totally given up. Okay, so China is still relevant. Just their total their share in a company's total sourcing portfolio probably will continue to drop. There's one more point I think we really need to pay attention to. That is, China is also shifting its role in the supply chain in Asia. China is not just satisfied with just being an apparel exporting country. China is more ambitious than that. China is also very interested in serving as a textile supplier for major apparel exporting countries in Asia. So I think these days there also has been some discussion, okay, how about let's reduce the fabric sourcing, the material sourcing from China? And personally, I think to do that, it will be much more challenging than simply move apparel manufacturing from China. Why? Because to make textiles, it's not that easy. You need machine, you need capital, you need technology. It will take much longer time to do that. Okay. And the next trend, also I think is a very hot topic. That is near sourcing. It's so popular, okay, because of COVID-19. It kind of reminds us we need to have more speed to market. We need to pay attention to supply chain risk. That being said, if you just look at the data, I still do not see near sourcing is happening in a large scale. You can see my view often is kind of a minority view, but really, just to double sure, I look at the data both in quantity and also in value, but neither really show near sourcing is happening. Why is that? I try to figure out some reasons. There are several factors we can consider. As we are now this year, U.S. fashion companies are really under tremendous financial pressures. Sales is going down because of lockdown, because consumers not spending. But at the same time, they're facing increasing sourcing cost. Why sourcing cost is increasing is more than just about wage increase. It's also about logistic cost. Okay, but no matter how, they're under tremendous pressure. Okay, you're selling less, your cost is increasing. What would you do? Of course, I'm going to consolidate my existing resources. In the past, just like us, maybe in the past, I will visit 10 grocery stores, okay, each week. But now, because of so many restraints out there, I can only visit one. Okay, so what kind of supermarkets you will visit to kind of do your weekly grocery now? Well, of course, the supermarket that can offer the most variety of choices and also maybe can offer the best price. Okay, the same. When we asked retailers how your sourcing strategy will evolve in the next 2 years, and in the past they always tell us, well, we will move on to, we will explore new sourcing destinations. We will, try some new vendors. But this time, the key words we see is fewer suppliers, fewer countries. Okay. And now let's take a look, what are the options available on the table? So here we asked our respondents to rate some key sourcing destinations against the key sourcing criteria. And you can see really in terms of the sourcing cost, Asian countries overall are much more competitive than those countries, okay, in the Western hemisphere, like near sourcing. And their competitiveness is not sourcing cost. And at the same time, respondents say China and Vietnam overall are more balanced sourcing destination. And also I look at the market data again. So I'm tracking the average price of those apparel sold in the US market. And you can see, made in Mexico are much more pricey, except for tops. For the majority of product category, they're much more pricey than those similar products imported from Asia. Okay. So price disadvantage, consumers are more kind of price sensitive this year. So of course, if you suffer from price advantage, consumers are not interested in buying your products. But also, I think this is also very interesting. If you look at the product assortment by country, those products, sourced from China, they're most diverse, almost any product category. Okay, Vietnam, Bangladesh, relatively more kind of narrow, but still it looks okay. You can buy a lot of different products. Or put it this way, you still can buy a lot of different products from Vietnam and from Bangladesh. However, if you look at what we source from Mexico, okay, 86% are tops. Well, definitely, in our daily life, we need more than just tops, right? But for products we source from Mexico, mostly are just tops. The same with CAFTA and also Haiti. Majority of them, 57% are tops, 24 are bottoms. So you can see the type of products we can source from Western Hemisphere, very, very limited, much more limited than what we can source from Asia. So once again, this is why you cannot really simply replace China, replace Asia by near sourcing, right? So I think I've talked a lot. So just a quick kind of conclusion, summarizing what I just mentioned. One is, hopefully, I think the value of U.S. apparel imports will rebound despite the new uncertainties. Once again, if consumers continue to spend, I think we should have some hopes here. Second, I think no matter what will happen, I think Asia remains the dominant apparel sourcing base for U.S. fashion companies. And the third, China is still relevant. It's still in one of the essential sourcing base, even though, yes, we're reducing China exposure. And last but not least, near sourcing, the popularity will still be there. Still there are a lot of, there will be a lot of discussion, but to which extent or how largely it will happen, still I think there is a question mark here. All right, so that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay. Thank you very much, you two. Let me take a look here if we have any questions from the audience. Okay, I have a question. Sheng, this is to you. So you mentioned earlier that China will always be relevant as a supply chain and manufacturing hotspot. You mentioned that they do have the technology, they have the infrastructure, they've been doing it for a long time. They're one of the most established areas to source. Is that something that, because a lot of times when people think about, especially now, China is starting to go in the more unaffordable route as far as the manufacturing hotspots. Is this something, because they have the infrastructure, because they have the technology, and speed to market is such a huge thing these days, is that something that feeds into shorter lead times, which can then add into a cost saving? Sheng, you there?
Oh, I thought you were asking Julie.
Oh no, that was to you.
Sure. Yes. So once again, I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think China is still relevant. And also just think about why, in the media, we have some discussion, some sourcing orders are kind of moving back to China. One reason is because China's competitor, they're kind of struggling with COVID. So China overall is, I think they control the virus, or most of their factories there can operate normally. Okay, but if you look at those factories in India, in Cambodia, I think their capacity is much more, significantly affected. But also, I think the supply chain is still based in China. China is still regarded as a country that has the most complete supply chain for making textile and apparel. So it's not just about, you having a garment factory there, then you can operate. Just think about where you got your material, where you got your accessories. There's a saying, I think it's very true. You are not killed by a lion, you're killed by a mosquito. I think it's really just showcase how sophisticated or how those small suppliers that can really affect your destiny. So in the current situation, I think China maybe is an easy pickup. They're available, they have the capacity, they can just fulfill your order. But in the long run, I think still the interest is there. Let's just move out of China. And also China is not interested in just being an apparel exporting country. Once again, apparel is regarded as labor intensive. China wants to make more textiles, want to enter more kind of high-end industry, right? Just look at, just ask the young generation in China, very, much fewer, putting this in, much fewer want to work in a garment factory. They're more interested in, go to college and more interested in to kind of find a white collar job rather than working in factory. I think this will also change the dynamic. That being said, I think one more thing I should mention in my presentation, that is, if you look at Asia as a whole, it's more than just a sourcing base for US fashion brands and retailers. If you look at the data, there's a forecast. By 2024, of the world top 5 largest apparel consumption market, 3 will be located in Asia. That's huge. So in Asia, making Asia for Asia, I think will also be a very important trend in the future. So this is also why U.S. companies are not that willing to totally kind of decoupling their relationship with Asia, especially with China. So that's my point.
Okay, thank you. Very, very in-depth answer. Let me check my Facebook feed here. Okay, no other questions from the audience. Julie, I have another question for you. So you mentioned earlier that we have yet to see what if the Biden administration will do as far as lifting some of the, or keeping in place some of these tariff exceptions for certain product categories. What do you think is more likely to happen based on the evidence that you've seen so far? I know Joe Biden hasn't been as vocal about his trade policy in that regard, but what do you think, in your opinion, is more likely to happen?
Yeah, it's always dangerous to make predictions, but I do think what we can expect to see in the Biden administration is that they are going to take a measured approach. They're going to do a review of the measures that are out there. And my guess is that they are likely to shift direction as we re-enter with global alliances and we talk with our trading partners. I expect that we'll see more EU-US joint action. And I think that looking at China is going to be part of that, looking at the World Trade Organization. So I think it's going to be slow. I would like to say on day one, all these tariffs should go away. They're crazy. But, reality, I think, is that they'll move slower than that because of the kind of the political indication of, no one wants to say they're free trade. They're going to look at it and then they'll make some decisions. That's why we're worried about the product exclusions that expire at the end of December in this administration, because if they expire, I don't expect a Biden administration to renew any of those exclusions. They're going to be doing their analysis.
We did have a question coming here from one of our participants. What trade agreements or policies are in place in Asia for China to maintain its dominance in the region? Who wants to tackle that one?
RCEP, RCEP definitely is a kind of very hot topic these days. I just have two personal comments. One is I think RCEP definitely will have an impact in Asia. Especially I think it's a good news. Somehow I think it's good news to the supply chain in Asia. I think it will really facilitate a more integrated, economically integrated supply chain in Asia. And you can see in the future, for apparel products made in, say, made the ASEAN members, they can more easily and at a lower cost to get their raw material. Okay. And a second, I think there will be a ripple effect. That is, if you look at Wall Street Journal, look at some think tank, even though I personally don't think US may join CPTPP too early, too soon, but there will be more kind of push. Okay, you have RCEP, you have CPTPP, and the US is not, is a member to neither of these two programs. Okay, and you need to consider rejoining or something. But no, somehow I think this is something a little bit disappointing. We should make trade agreements an economic policy. Or just putting this way, we should really think about the economic benefits, okay, of regional trade agreements. But nowadays, if you look at US trade policy, it's more like we treat it like a foreign policy. We're kind of giving more consideration to geopolitics. We totally ignore or really kind of do not give enough kind of consideration to the economic benefits of regional free trade agreements. So this is why they're interesting. Sometimes US companies say, I would rather just forego the benefits from a free trade agreement rather than just using it, because it does not really match with my supply chain, really match with from where I source my products. So how to make trade agreements, trade policy, and economic policy rather than just talking about politics. I think this could be something to consider in the future. Julia, I'm
yeah,
sure.
I just want to add to what Sheng said, because I do think though that it's really important, and for brands and retailers. So when we talk about global trade, the irony here is that we're creating measures that will make it easier to source and trade within different trading blocks. It never needs to touch the US at all. And so I kind of agree, and that's why Trade Promotion Authority, to go back to a Washington policy issue that I think will be very important next year. So RCEP is great. That means that if you're selling into China and you're going to do some co-production, it's going to be easier to do business. And eventually, I think the next administration will turn to trade policy. I just don't think that it's going to be, in the first 100 days as one of the priorities.
Okay. Got a couple more questions here on a Q&A. Will the just signed RCEP benefit China PNC industry or more, or just a?
Sorry, 1 second. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah. You just cut out for a minute.
Yeah.
You guys see the chat function here?
Yeah.
Okay, here's the question. It's a little bit.
Have you done any analysis of this, Sheng? I think, from the theory, you think yes, it will be benefiting China as well as the ASEAN countries.
Yeah, well, last time I did a study like 2 years ago, India was still a member of RCEP, and now left. So I think totally changed my results. But overall, from an economic perspective, I think it's kind of hard to really, say or kind of put like a zero-sum game. So I think both the ASEAN members and China will benefit from lowered kind of trade barriers because of RCEP. And also, China and ASEAN, they're kind of having a free trade agreement, and itself will facilitate more trade flows between these two regions. So I think both will benefit from this agreement. But once again, if you want to add the non-economic factor, then it's really hard to tell. Is it like RCEP will became a tool for China to kind of advance its Belt and Road Belt and Road initiative?
Yeah.
Something hard to say. But just from the industry perspective, from economic perspective, definitely I think this is something good. This is something good.
Well, and I do think just from the policy side, it makes it harder for an administration, Trump administration or Biden administration, to try to, isolate China. So, part of the goal in the Trump administration was to isolate China and, cut off relations. And I think it's much harder to do the more trading patterns that you have and something like RCEP. So I think that is a positive.
Mm-hmm. But one thing, just to add one quick point, even without RCEP, the data already shows Asian countries overall, tend to import more and more textiles from within Asia. And largely it is contributed by China. And if you look at the data for Vietnam, for Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, you name it, almost all of these countries, more than 60% of their textiles nowadays come from China. RCEP will further reduce the tariff rate, further make it less costly to import raw material from China. So what's the implication for U.S. textile industry? So I know U.S. textile industry, they export a lot. Over 40% of their output nowadays are exported. But also 70% of their exports went to members of CAFTA and NAFTA. Somehow this is so kind of, so concentrated. They need to figure out where is their next market, right? There's always the current actual market is very limited. They need to think about how to use trade agreements to kind of explore a new market. So this is something, if RCEP is enter into force, it will make it even more challenging for U.S. textile companies to find it to kind of find its role in Asia. So I think this could be the ripple effect we can think about.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry, these things keep cutting in and out. Where does Africa fit into the competitive landscape for emerging providers? China is making investments there for garment production. When can we expect to see them being a major provider in Africa?
Sheng, do you want, I'll let Sheng talk about the data, but I wanted, from a policy perspective, I think that, we've been talking about how can we encourage more sourcing from Africa for a long time, and AGOA has really helped a lot with that development. And we see, the investment in Ethiopia and the potential to negotiate an FTA with Kenya. So I think there are real opportunities there. That's still 20 years after AGOA went into effect, we still haven't really seen that full potential. But I do think that's the future, and that's what we'll be looking at in our policy discussions.
Okay. Next is, what do the, hold on a second. What do the opportunities for U.S. brands and the strategy, what are the opportunities for U.S. brands and what is their strategy for RCEP? Is that
too early to tell, right?
Yeah.
I mean, okay. So now that I think it's probably 2 years that we last did a presentation diving deep into RCEP. I think now that it's signed, we all need to take a fresh look. I mean, in general, it's a positive because it's going to make it easier to do business and to source among the RCEP parties. But kind of looking at specific products and specific rule changes, that's something that that from a policy perspective, we're just diving into now.
Right, and also always the devil is in the detail. So this afternoon I'm going to study the text to see the tariff, the kind of tariff-free schedule, the rules of origin, they define how they allow the regional content to play. Really, unless we fully understand these detailed rules, then we can start to evaluate its potential impact, the economic impact.
Yeah.
Stay tuned, everybody, is what that means. So we have yet to see how this all impacts the industry. Question for both of you. What for some of our viewers here, what is the best maybe a couple of resources they could use. I know USFIA is a great one in general for them to learn more about these trade policies and what's happening globally.
I mean, of course, that's our mission at USFIA is how can we, provide information that's usable to brands and retailers, right? That you can take back and share with your colleagues or share with the C-suite to kind of have a analysis and understanding of what's going on and what the potential is. And that's why, partnering with Sheng on the benchmarking so that we also can do, take innovative looks at what's happening and kind of some benchmarking with peers as well.
Right. And I totally agree with Julie, and also I highly recommend all the work with Julie's organization. I think nowadays we need more partnership between our educational institutions and the industry. As a scholar, my expertise is trade and sourcing. I have the data, I have the theories, but on Julie's organization, their members have the real stories. So really, win-win collaboration will regenerate more kind of valuable and informative research outcome. So I highly recommend.
Well, I did include links to both the USFIA newsroom and the industry news and intel links down in the chat. So if anybody would like to use those as a resources to keep up to date, this is something that affects all areas of the apparel industry. It doesn't matter how big you are as a brand or a retailer. So the more you know, the more you'll be able to avoid pitfalls and ultimately have a cost savings and benefit your customers. So let me see if there's any more questions over here. Okay, great. I think that's all we have for questions. Let me double check one more thing. Okay, great. Thank you so much to both of our panelists. I would like to remind everyone that we do have a matchmaking room in the virtual dashboard. I will paste the link here. So I highly recommend everybody after the seminar to go visit this room. It's essentially taking the place of our show floor. It's a great place. It's essentially a live hangout. It's a great place to do some networking, connect with suppliers, chat with show staff if you have any questions, and also our speakers and panelists will be popping in and out of there if you'd like to ask any more questions. So again, thank you so much, both of you, for your wonderful insights.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for the chance to join you.
Yeah.
All right, take care.